Western conceptions of the international struggle among nations and other political actors often use binary war or peace labels to describe it. The actual truth is more complicated. So out of the gate, we're already getting somewhere. Out of the gate, we have to recognize that you can be competing with someone, but you're not at war with them. And there's an infinite degree of gray area in there. And guess what? Right out of the gate, that's what struck me right out of the gate. Guess what? When you're influencing someone, there's a whole degree of levels of pressure that you can exert to go from influencing. Because let's face it, if I put a gun to your head, is that influence?
Yes.
Yes, it is. So influence and competing, very, very similar. Continuing on. Actors on the world stage are always trying to create a relative advantage for themselves and for their group. Sometimes this maneuvering leads to violence. But the use of violence to achieve goals is more often the exception than the rule. Now, here's where this, again, if I'm trying to influence Echo Charles, there's levels of influence. Could one of those levels be a double leg takedown?
Yes.
And ground and pound? Yes, it could. How often does that happen? I mean, how often do people physically fight? Not very often. When you think of all the human interactions that we have where we're trying to influence each other or trying to compete with each other. See, it's a weird thing though, because on the one side you've got competition, on the other side you've got influence. And the continuum of how you apply these pressures are all over the place. So it continues on. Instead, most actors use other means in their competitive interactions, right, to achieve their goals. So we're not looking to go to war. The competition continuum encompasses all of these efforts, including the use of violence. Okay. So there you go. Continues on. And by the way, this idea of competitive interactions and influence interactions, this is what's happening. This is what is happening, right? When we're interacting, so many of the interactions that we have with people are either competitive or they're influence, right? We're constantly trying to get someone to do something, get someone to come on our side, get someone to give us the support that we need, get them to move in this direction. That's what people are doing. Continuing on, there are several reasons for explaining the competition continuum to Marines. The first is to make them aware that from recruitment to retirement, they are an integral part of the nation's strategic competition with other actors. Marines are always competing even when they are not fighting in combat. So this is something to think about as a person, as a leader. As a leader, you're always influencing. Even when you're not standing up in front of the troops giving a speech about where you're going or what the strategic, even then, even when you're sitting down to eat chow, guess what you're doing? You're influencing. You're competing. This is always happening. Then it rolls into this. When you understand those things, it says next, understanding unleashes creativity. The Marine Corps coming at you with unleashing creativity, right? When you go to art school, do you think they say, well, listen, the goal of this art school is to get you to unleash your creativity? No, the Marine Corps will say that. And isn't it interesting? We're 2 paragraphs in and we're talking about the creative aspects of competition. And then hand in hand with that, the creative aspects of influence. Carrying on. Once Marines understand the nature and form of competition, their innovative spirit will lead to the development of new kinds of competition, new kinds of competitive advantages. Finally, this publication expands the discussion on how and where Marines fit into the continuum and where to look for their natural partners in competition. By design, this is a small book with a construction that parallels Marine Corps Doctrinal Publication 1, Warfighting, which is one of the first publications we covered on this podcast. It is not intended as a reference manual, but it is designed to be read from cover to cover. This publication does not contain specific techniques or procedures we should adopt. Rather, it provides broad guidance in the form of concepts with illustrations intended to stimulate thinking and encourage additional learning. It requires judgment in application. This is the way I like to learn. This is the way I like to teach. So and the really easy thing to talk about is jiu-jitsu, right? You want to be able to teach. The advantage of this broad position is this. The thing you need to do when you're in this situation broadly is win this underhook, whatever the thing is. And that's what this book is. It's not like, hey, here's, in this situation, it's not formulaic. Continuing on, we live in a time of renewed great power competition in an era of exponential technological and social change. Marines enjoy a rich heritage of advancing our nation's interest in these kinds of struggles. As we look to the future, we must ensure today's and tomorrow's Marines do the same. Like maneuver warfare, and just that statement followed by anything kind of warms my heart. Like maneuver warfare, competing is a way of thinking. It's a way of thinking. And man, Dave, I kind of went berserk on like decentralized command as a way of thinking not too long ago. Yeah. Right? I mean, I went on EF Online. I spent 2 or 3 days of the sessions talking about decentralized command as a way of thinking. And it's so interesting how much that changes your perspective about something when you think of it not in a linear way, like, oh, this is what you're going to do, but this is the entire way of thinking. It's like saying, oh, when you fight someone, you can get them to the ground and you can grapple with them instead of punching them. That's just a whole new way of thinking. You don't even know one single move about it, but you know this idea that you can then utilize. We must understand the importance of strategic competition and the essential role Marines play in it for our nation. I missed this line. It says, we all need to read, study, and debate this publication with our fellow Marines. You chimed in on that one, didn't you, Dave?
Yeah.
What do you like about that?
I like that. I like the explanation of this. I went through the same thing initially when I was kind of looking at this. There was parts of it that I was thinking it was going to be like war fighting. But it had this kind of intellectual, this thought process thing, this idea that what he's saying, the guy in charge of the Marine Corps, you need to go out there and debate this and think about this. And he's using words like creativity and intellect. Those are not the words you would normally think of when you think of the Marine Corps. Creativity, intellectual, and debate. Those are just not the things you'd think of. And those are things he's saying that you need to do.
And what I really like about it is we think of the Marine Corps, we think of the military in general, and then we think of the Marine Corps, of course, of being this hierarchy that is just as strict as you can imagine. And here's a document, and General David H. Berger, the Commandant of the Marine Corps, is saying the purpose of this document is to make you debate. Not to just obey what it says, but to make you debate. We want you to think. And that's a beautiful thing. So there we are. We are now done with the forward. Let's get into what the book actually says. The nature of competition, chapter 1. Total war and perfect peace rarely exist in practice. Instead, they are the extremes between which exist the relations among most political groups. This range includes routine economic competition, more or less permanent political or ideological tension, and occasional crisis among groups. So, what's that? That's from Warfighting, the Marine Corps Manual, number 1. And by the way, these things that we're talking about, tensions, competition, not violent competition, but just competition, where do those things exist? They exist. Sure, they exist between countries, but guess where else they exist? They exist between companies, and guess where else they exist? Between departments inside of companies, and guess where they exist? Between people inside of departments inside of companies. Inside your family, there's competition going on. These words from the Marine Corps' warfighting philosophy frame the idea of competition for Marines. They also serve as a springboard for Marines to think about how they can contribute to winning the nation's competitions, including the ones taking place below the threshold of violence, which, by the way, is 99.999% of competitions. Violence is rare. And when we get into influence, look, it's almost cheesy for me to talk about influence of like, well, if I put a gun to your head or I beat you with a baseball bat to get you to do what I want you to do, right? That's a rare form of influence that doesn't happen all the time. But there is a threshold of violence. And I think as we talk about it, and I haven't fully hashed out these ideas in my head, but there's a transition time when you're influencing. There's a transition time when you go from indirect to direct form of influencing. There's a transition that you cross, and it's not quite a threshold of violence, but there's a transition that takes place, and I think we'll find some comparisons to it in here. But I think about that all the time. How much? At what point do you go from indirect to direct? And it's funny. We had somebody on EF Online the other day, and this type of question came up. But what I was explaining was the escalation of counseling, right? And you start off by saying, hey, bro, are you good? Are you okay? And then it goes to like, hey, this is a problem. And then it goes to, hey, I'm going to write you up. And then you get written up, and then you fire somebody if you have to. And then I'm sitting there talking, I go, you know how many times in my life I made it past the lowest level of escalation of counseling? The times that I said, hey, Dave, it doesn't look like the gear was ready in time. And Dave was like, dude, sorry, we late, blah, blah, blah. And it never happens again. Yeah. That's 97%. There's another 2% where it was like, hey, bro, that's the second time we almost missed our movement because the gear wasn't ready. Do you need help? No, I got it. And it never happens again. That's another 2%. Now we're at 99%. There's another point whatever percent where I actually had to write somebody up. And there's 0.00 whatever where I had to take action to fire somebody or get rid of them. The same thing as you go through this escalation of war. You should be able to get people to do what you want them to do through non-war without breaking the threshold of violence.